your after lunch exercise. If I was still in classroom, I would ask you to stand, and I'd ask everyone to walk to the front and then go back. But because of how the room is structured, I'm unable to do that. So unfortunately, you won't have much time to do your after lunch exercise. So we have to get right into our conference. Let me firstly say welcome back to everyone for this session. And firstly, let me introduce myself. I'm Denzel Williams, and I will be guiding the presentations for this particular session. Firstly, though, I would like to again express my own congratulations to the Mono ICT Policy Center for hosting this 5th conference, and say how important this particular discussion or these discourses over the past 5 years have been towards shaping policy in terms of information communication technologies in our jurisdiction. I want to say that the theme that you are using today, understanding FinTech, ransomware, and cyber threat to governance, is indeed an important conversation to have, especially given that we are now living in what we call a knowledge-driven development space. And so security is going to be critical for us to make sure that we can minimize the risk of our operations while at the same time optimize the benefits that we're able to get from operating in the digital space. So these conversations, I think, are very useful to start shaping policies as to how best we can actually improve our broader competitiveness in the general scheme of things, and making sure that we are not left behind. So I want to thank Professor Hopton Dunn and his team from CARIMAC, but CARIMAC is now actually the Caribbean School of Media and Communication. I think you should give him a round of applause, because as you know, it was an institute, and with his vision, he has moved it now from an institute to a school, which I think is a massive, massive benefit for the UWI as well. So ladies and gentlemen, we have today as our theme for this particular session, FinTech, cybersecurity, and business readiness. We are going to be discussing the emergent digital financial technologies and services, and also the implications of traditional ecosystems and models, and the repositioning and readiness requirements of Jamaican banking sector. I am pretty sure that sounds like a mouthful, but we have what I would consider the best team in the business to deliver their verdict on such an important topic. And so today we are going to start off our presentation with Mr. Craig Spiezle, who is recognized as a thought leader and pioneer on the convergence of interactive marketing, society, and digital commerce. He was hired by Microsoft in 1992, and he held various managerial positions, including international channel development, product management, licensing, and product support. During his tenure, he championed digital inclusiveness and the societal impact of internet literacy and access. He holds a Bachelor's of Science degree from Rochester Institute of Technology and an MBA from Seattle University. He is indeed well qualified to speak on the topic today. Similarly, we have our own homegrown, highly respected Simon Roberts, who is the Chief Information Officer for the Grace Kennedy Group. He has held significant leadership roles within Grace Kennedy, including general manager of 3 Grace Kennedy factories and CEO of Hardware and Lumber. Simon holds a BASc in Metallurgic and Material Sciences from the University of Toronto and an MASc in Management Sciences from the University of Waterloo. These are very, very important areas of study, and I'm pretty sure you're very, very highly competent to speak on the issue of cyber security, FinTech, and the whole issue of governance. So ladies and gentlemen, We have the best team in the business. They're going to be speaking to you for at least 25 minutes or so. And then we're going to open the floor for a set of engaging questions. I will be guiding the proceedings in the questions. I'm going to turn over to our two presenters, Mr. Spiezle and then Mr. Roberts, and then we're going to go into our questions. So sit back, relax, listen carefully, and we look forward to a vibrant round of questioning. Thank you.
Thank you for those kind remarks, and I too want to recognize Professor Dunn and the school here for pulling together a great program that's very timely and I think very important, and not just for the financial sector, but I think all aspects of commerce as we know it and for consumers. Hopefully we'll have a lively conversation in Q&A like we had earlier. So, but there's a lot of topics I do want to touch on, and I tried to kind of weave some of these in based on the earlier session this morning. So we look at FinTech, and I would actually say this could apply to any industry, but there's a tremendous amount of disruption, evolution, and revolution, and that can be great or it can be a challenge. It can be something we get excited about or something keeps us up at night. But again, in many ways, technology is becoming the competitive force here. And it's not just technology of our traditional competitors, it's also the technology that the cyber criminals are using. And as we heard earlier, they too are very sophisticated. In fact, they collaborate sometimes even better than we do. They're quicker to adopt new technologies, and sometimes they're quicker to recognize market opportunities. So clearly that's a big challenge. As we look at this, we look at where's the financial services market go. And again, for our parents, they would go in line and that was their banking relationship. They'd wait in line for the next teller. And then obviously ATMs come into place, and that was new technology, and that was revolutionary. It was changing the way we do banking. And then obviously online banking, and that's many of us are doing today. And in many countries around the world, mobile is the big aspect today. And I think more importantly here in this slide is there's new entrants coming into play in the banking, non-traditional banking entities, and we're also looking away Bitcoin and such. So the slide is thinking about not only where we've been, but where is banking going today, and how's the role of FinTech coming into play. So this slide is one of my favorite slides because I use, and many people use, the expression data is the oil of the economy today in every business. And more businesses, and I talk to people, their business isn't selling a device, it's how they're going to monetize data. And that conversation we had in the earlier session about data protection regulations has a big impact, and it's very important as we think about the control of power of data. So it's something to really think about. But we can't do this all alone. And we've used this expression, it takes a village, and it very much requires collaboration and shared information. And not just among competitors, but we also talked about law enforcement. They can be an ally and very important to work with us, and they also need to work with us together. The other part, and I'm going to touch on here, is we need to also step up to the plate ourselves. And so reasonable and embrace security standards and privacy practices. And all too often, the breaches that we hear about are not very sophisticated. They could have been avoided if we had only had the due diligence. And I like to suggest, and we'll see if Simon's comments later, is a lot of this is less of a technical problem, but more of an operation and people problem. And how do we manage the data in our place here? And the other part here is, again, there's an old saying, there's people that have either had a breach or don't know they've had a breach. And again, we have to plan for the worst in this area. There's no perfect security. We need to do everything we can do to help prevent it, but as importantly, to detect it when it has happened. And, again, we're talking about ransomware earlier over lunch, and again, people who know they've had ransomware or people are going to have it. So again, prevention, detection, notification. On that notification, I'll touch on a little bit, but it's if someone else notices you have an incident, how do they notify you and how do you respond? And then obviously, how do you remediate and recover? So those are some of the 5 buckets. Some people use different terms when we think about readiness that I think are very key for every industry. But if we look at the challenges for the financial services industry, you know, again, originally it was within your four walls of your bank. You looked at your servers, you looked at your processes. But today, more and more of us are linking and using some other cloud services for different aspects of our business. And it may be for some credit card transactions. It might be part of your business that's using for payroll, all other systems. So that's the beauty of cloud services. It provides you a great ability of services and scalability. But that also means you need to be thinking about how are they securing your data? What are they doing? When do they notify you? So that's a challenge that we have. And to add to the challenge is all the connected IoT devices that are being brought into the workplace. And so we've touched a little bit over lunch, we chatted a little bit IoT. That's the big threat landscape today that's just making it harder for people like Simon and others that are responsible, is how do you manage all of this? And if we look at IoT, and we've spent a lot of time at the Internet Society, and there's some white papers we have available you can download, many aspects of it. Again, there's when we're talking about IoT devices, for the sake of conversation today, I'm talking about what I call consumer-grade devices that are used in the home or the office. These TVs would be an example of a consumer-grade IoT device. It's not a critical control, but it has connectivity. They're smart TVs. They're collecting data on what you view on it. They have microphones. They have cameras. So they're connected. And if I can compromise one of them, I can compromise the rest of the organization. So that becomes that challenge in there. So one of the challenges with IoT, it's not just the device. Most all devices connect with some back-end cloud service. So as you look at that, you know, if you think about the traditional thermostat in your home, there's a mobile app that connects to that. So that increases that aspect there. And so you look at the three dimensions. You have the device, the data that's going back and forth in the cloud, and then the apps that are controlling it. And so combined with the amount of data that's collected, and I use the word ambient data. Has anyone heard that term before, ambient data? Great. It's a word that I like to talk about. It's small little bits of data that you may think is very benign, but when all this data is combined, it really creates a tremendous mosaic and picture of who you are, what you do, and what your interests are. So it's just a small little parts. And by ambient data, it's the thermostat that tracks you when you walk into a room. It's a TV that tracks what you watch on TV. It's a computer that's looking at what you're seeing. So all that combined creates a very comprehensive mosaic and provides a lot of capabilities of predictive analysis of what you're going to do in the future. So when we think about that, that's a real challenge. But the bigger challenge is all these devices that are coming to market. How many people have a connected device, or a thermostat, or a Google Home? Show of hands, just give me an idea here. No one is right. I only have one hand. Either we have people that are lying to me, or they're off the grid. That's very interesting. So you look at the connected coffee pots. You have who has a smart TV? Let me ask that question. Okay, well that's a connected device, you know. And actually, Symantec actually, and there was an example of actually malware went down to a TV that was ransomware, and to unlock your TV, you had to pay ransomware. And so this illustration here is kind of a comic here, but it shows all these connected things. And a lot of things like the connected broom, I'm not really sure if I need that. But I've seen the connected rice cooker, steamer. But as we think about the connected toothbrush, all these devices are coming into the workplace and the home, and what are their security implications here? And we saw earlier in the year this DDoS attack that compromised home surveillance camera, security camera system. And the DDoS compromised those devices that then did a bot attack against major websites. And that distributed attack that became very magnitude brought down Akamai, it brought down Amazon. There was a huge amount of impact in there. And so as we think about the challenge with ransomware and connected devices, is that amplified impact can have. And it's not just on you, but it's how your device is now impacting someone else. So that's a big challenge that we're seeing. And the threats are no longer in the online world. They transcend to the physical world. So if I can compromise a device and it unlocks your front door, that becomes a physical problem. If it opens your garage door opener. So as we think about all these connected devices, we think about Alexa. Who has an Alexa? A few people I see, a little bit there. So if I'm outside your house and I say, Alexa, open the front door. Right now, Alexa doesn't have an authentication mechanism of validating my voice signature to do that. So that's a challenge that we have today as we think about these connected devices. So again, not to scare you too much here, but those are things that are keeping me up. I don't sleep real well, as you can tell. But here's some examples here, and obviously I think most of you know about the Jamaican issue here of ransomware. But this is a good example of here, and this happened in Austria here, about ransomware and hotel locks. So we all have in a hotel, and we have a card, and it's electronic. We don't have keys anymore. That's a connected device. It's connected to a system that records a MAG card that allows you with an RFID chip technically in there. Well, they locked all those doors. So guess what? So it's not just your traditional data that's being used, it's ransomware impacting a business. I put that out here just to illustrate, to think the broader scope of what ransomware can do. So think about a hotel now. It's not only is your registration system shut down, and maybe you could say, well, you can hand credit card here, but people can't get in the rooms. So, which was amazing. I don't know much about those locks, but I'd have to think there's some fail-safe system that would allow that to do that, but I guess not. Otherwise, it makes a great headline. So reality is everyone is being targeted here today. And if you don't know that, and if you're not looking at your logs, I think you're fooling yourself. And in the case of Equifax, and it's a company I like to beat up and criticize, but they're a good example of doing everything wrong right now. And I apologize if anyone's in there. And the reality is it could have been prevented. There was a known vulnerability. It was a known patch. And they, in their systems, did not implement it. And a lot of reasons behind that. They didn't have a ticketing system in place to manage those type of priorities. So typically in a large infrastructure, you would have a system that would log it in that had visibility and would track when has it been patched. So they didn't do that. On top of that, they were contacted by an outside researcher also who said, hey, your servers are vulnerable, but they ignored those warnings. So that's a good example of what could have been prevented. And I think it's something to think about. And I suggest that is less of a technical problem, and that's where I come back to that being more of an operational problem. There was a known solution out there. It does take time to patch these systems, but we have to appreciate that. But they didn't have the follow through in their operations to manage that. So there's a lesson learned for us clearly in that arena here. So baseline standards here. So there are some things that the Internet Society is really promoting quite a bit. And again, there's also some efforts by different government agencies. So first of all, HTTPS. There was a woman earlier who asked a question. I was told before to always look for the S online there. Are you here? Back there? Okay, so this is for you. And that's a real challenge in the past. And that's something very important. But we're actually saying that the entire session should be encrypted from the client device to the backend server, so every page. So that is becoming a new norm. It's being now required by government agencies in the US, in the EU, and that's the expectation. To the question that was asked earlier about can I trust it just because it has the S, and the answer is no. And the problem there is that the criminals now can get the certificates for free. And so there's something called Let's Encrypt, which I personally think is actually enabling, I shouldn't say personally, it's a fact that it's enabling criminals to get certificates. So they create a bogus phishing site and they get now a free certificate. So there's no friction in place there. On the other hand, it's great free to reduce the cost to drive encryption forward, but the bad guys also benefit from that. But that's an area that's very important, and also encrypting the whole flow of email. The other one is email authentication, and the gentleman from the Jamaican police talked about business email compromise, BEC he had on there. And that's an area where, again, more and more emails being very targeted for phishing to get someone to open it up, to open a document and then compromise their machine, which drives ransomware. And the good news is there's actually technical standards out there today to help can prevent that. And that's called email authentication. So I'm not going to go into those specifically. I have resources in there, but there are good solutions today. And again, these are considered baseline security practices that are being required right now. And so in the U.S., the Department of Homeland Security now requires government agencies to adopt that, again, to help curb it. There's no perfect defense. And I suggest that some ideas that in Jamaica could also embrace too. These are global standards. They're also being standardized in the EU as we speak, and the UK as well have embraced the email authentication side of things. So the good news here, but again, this is a global number here from Symantec and the FBI about the scale of business email compromises, and ransomware is that. And to remember that email is a tactic of choice for cyber criminals. We open mail too often, we get so much of it, and we click on it. So that's an important part there. And last but not least is another reason to do this is Google now is issuing warnings on their browser if your site is not embraced HTTPS. So if you want to maximize the customer engagement, that's a great incentive. And then also, if you're also looking at search engine optimization, they actually degrade your search engine scores if your site's not fully encrypted. So, and it's not just a logon page, it's the entire, every page of your website. And happy to kind of answer that. So I do want to add this slide at the last minute here about, there was a question I also answered this morning about how are Jamaican businesses doing, how are Jamaican banks doing in certain areas. And I thought I'd kind of share with you something and also get some feedback from you. For the last 11 years, or 9 years, excuse me, the Online Trust Alliance, which is part of the Internet Society, does something called an online trust audit. And we look at 1,000 websites, and we look at about over 100 data attributes of how secure is a site, what are their privacy policies, have they had regulatory fines, a whole combination of data points that comes up with a composite score and analysis. And what's very disappointing, and this does not include any Jamaican banks because we only looked at the top 100 banks, but it shares some data. First of all, every year we raise the criteria here. So the bar gets raised every year. And what's incredible is each year more and more organizations make the honor roll. That's a good news. So if you think about it, it's not on a curve. So again, companies that make it above. But what's really concerning, and if you can see here, in the banking sector. This is the banking sector right here. And you see this last year they dropped to 27%. Very concerning. The banks have the most sensitive data, and why are they dropping here? And the reason is a few things. The poor patching cadence. We look at how quickly an organization patches something, and we get that data. And we can do that by pinging a site. We also look at the privacy policies. And we talked about this morning about privacy policies and control of whose data is it? Is it your data or is it the bank's data? And the point here is that their privacy policies have actually taken a step backwards on transparency, which is really bad for consumers. And the other point is breaches. More of them have had breaches, and more of them have had regulatory settlements for everything from insider trading to deceptive business practice, a whole range of it. So that has brought the banking sector down, and what's ironic is all the other sectors have increased. So same exact criteria that we're looking at. So banks need to kind of, in certain ways, step up there. And I'm kind of thinking in the back of my mind, if we can get some support for it, we could look maybe in the Caribbean, and if we got enough banks together, look at them as a segment. The challenge is if you look at just a small few. If you only looked at number of Jamaican banks, if one of them was an outlier, it would skew the data. So what we're looking here is the top 100 retailers worldwide, the top 500 retailers, banks, the top consumer services. So again, I thought this would be of interest to talk about and something to think about going forward, and where the Internet Society is investing more to expand the scope of this report to global audiences here. So one of the challenges here with all these breaches, I'm suggesting we're approaching a tragedy of the trust commons. And the tragedy of the commons is really about the overgrazing of the farms in London and the UK, really how the term started. But if we think about trust as a finite asset, and we look at all these things that are happening today, are we really going to impact that? And one of the big areas is compliance. And those of you who get to know me, I have a real problem with the word compliance, because compliance to me is doing the minimum amount to stay out of jail, right? And versus stewardship. And stewardship is about doing the right thing. And I always say someone, stewardship is what your mother would want to hear that you're doing right. Compliance is what your attorney would ask you. But if we think about trust, it's really built on stewardship. So I think that's really important part there. And again, ethical data privacy practices is really important. And people say, well, they clicked the box and said yes. And yes might say we're going to sell your data to anyone we want, whenever we want, and put a tracker on your devices. Well, that's the compliance aspect of there. I'm not sure how ethical it is there. So we have to think about those areas. So that's a big area for the Internet Society, ethical privacy practices. But it's also a shared responsibility. All these areas, industry can't do it alone. And so multiple industries need to get together. It's a collaborative effort. It's the public and private sectors working together. I'm a big advocate of multi-stakeholder efforts. But I should say that's when the parties agree there's a problem and to work together to it. All too often we have multi-stakeholder efforts that the lobbying groups get involved, and their objective is to dilute the effort or not to do anything. So if we can get the stakeholders together to want to make a positive change, I think long term, and that's really what we're talking about in this image here about the tragedy of the commons, it's that long-term impact if we don't work together. It's the oil spill that's collective and over time affects the environment. So a few things here, and just to kind of wrap up just on time here, is learning from each other's mistakes. These images are from the Caribbean, by the way. I didn't take them, but I found them online here. But again, a lot of these problems, the breaches, even the ransomware, could have been prevented here. And it's a big area to think about. But it's very important having a plan in place. And what I'm talking about as a plan is a breach or a cyber incident plan. If you have ransomware, it's a problem. It's a bigger problem if you don't know how you're going to deal with it. We're talking about contacting law enforcement. The time of first meeting your law enforcement agency isn't in the middle of your incident. It's developing a relationship beforehand. And one of the other things, again, as a free resource that the Internet Society now has is a comprehensive breach readiness guide to help you walk through the questions and such there. And we can provide you, I have the links in the deck here as well. But again, very important in here. The other part is data minimization. If you don't collect the data, you can't lose it. So again, really be thinking hard. I'm not sure if it's fortunate or unfortunate. I've been involved in a lot of organizations that have had breaches, and as a consultant coming in. And one of the most embarrassing questions is when the CEO turns to someone and says, well, why do we have that data? And then someone turns and says, well, I'm not sure, but I thought, and then that conversation goes on. So meanwhile, they've collected some personal data that's been breached. They don't even know the business reason for it, and now they have to deal with the repercussions of it. So data minimization is a concept of collecting the least amount of data you need and maintain it for the least amount of time as possible. So very important part there. Security is not the IT department's job. They're the ones that get fired typically, but it's everyone's job in an organization. And all too often, especially with cloud, different organizations within a company go out and secure their own vendors. They don't necessarily go through a review with the IT or the security department. So I believe it's everyone's job here. Optics matter, again, and test your plans. I mean, a plan, having a plan and a book isn't do you any good when it's put on the shelf. It needs to be reviewed continually in there. So just to wrap it up here, again, looking ahead, this is I took this picture riding in late September. This is in the Badlands of South Dakota. It was a great ride. But again, we need to look ahead. I mentioned about encryption everywhere. The type of certificates that I think is very important is something called extended validation. It helps address that question of the woman in the back of what is the site I'm actually connected to. It actually, extended validation provides a verification of the identity of the site, and it is the company that says. Very important. I mentioned email authentication, and all these other areas are very important. I think the last point, and this was on a build, is plan for distributed, disruptive technologies as we go forward here. And think about blockchain, think about artificial intelligence from a security perspective, but also privacy. We're looking at facial recognition, mobile, or I should say biometrics, a lot of privacy aspects. So on one hand, they bring more security. On the other hand, they also open up more privacy concerns. And how do you find that balance? And more importantly, how do you make sure you're looking and addressing the security and the privacy risks at the same time? So that kind of is a summary of it. These slides will be available, and everything I mentioned here we have links to on there. So hopefully that gave you a lot of thought and provoking some of the challenges and opportunities. I do want to just summarize it and say that while I do stay at night worrying about these things, I also see the tremendous value we have of being connected to both not only commerce, but for society in general. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Craig. We're welcoming Simon. Please welcome Simon as well.
Professor Denzel Williams, Professor Hopeton Dunn, ladies and gentlemen, and my fellow panelists, of course, I'd like to just say all protocols observed, so in the interest of time. It's my pleasure to be here to provide a perspective on FinTech and business. If I go forward, can you switch over for me? Yeah, that'll be interesting. A whole new perspective. While I'm waiting, how many persons here heard this story recently of a plane that was a passenger plane that was diverted, that was heading to Malaysia, and they had to land somewhere in India? Show of hands. How many persons heard? Okay, a couple. Turns out that the story was all about privacy. What it was that husband and wife were traveling to the Far East from Dubai, and on the flight he fell asleep, and she used his thumb to open his phone, and what she discovered was quite displeasing, and she then got on so bad that the airline decided to divert and discharge him in Mumbai. They weren't arrested. I think the damage had already been done. So I'm here to talk a little bit about FinTech and business readiness. I want you to just focus on Alipay.com. It'll come back up in a little while. Okay, so disruptive innovation. Professor Clay Christensen has taught us a lot about disruptive innovation over many years. And the fact is that banking, focusing on banking, is but the latest, I think, to undergo major disruption. And this is following on from travel, and it's following on from telecoms, and it's following on from retail. Some of you may know that Amazon.com's market cap has grown 200–300% over the last few years, but every brick and mortar retailer's market cap has actually stayed flat or declined. A couple of them, like Sears, has declined by 95, 98, 99. I'm not sure what percent it is now, but they're soon to be out of business. They're already out of business in Canada, as I understand it. So the fact is that banking is definitely being hit. The incumbents, however, according to Clay Christensen, and he's so correct, is that they always, invariably respond with first laughter and then scorn when they see an emerging technology about to take them over. And what's interesting is that the underserved and the unserved consumers always respond with joy. And I want you to just think back in the Jamaican context of how everybody responded when Digicel emerged. And that's no disrespect to cable and wireless, but they were a monopoly, and so we see what happened. So what I want to also highlight then is that the point is that all banks are at risk, everyone. FinTechs are growing at an extraordinary rate. PayPal is the largest at this point, in theory. They're at about $44–45 billion of market cap, and they're growing like gangbusters. And the owner of PayPal, he's just doing quite well, thank you very much. But they're attracting massive funding, and they're just growing. They're into every area of the offer that traditional banks and financial services provide. So they're being very focused, but they're going after a chunk of the business. And remember, all of the incumbents, their initial response was laughter and scorn. They're also extremely agile. They're generally mobile first. And for those who don't know that terminology, it means that you can access everything on your smartphone. You don't have to go to the web. You don't actually have to open up your tablet or computer to get to the services. And they're highly, highly, highly consumer focused. Now, if that describes your commercial bank, good for you. And again, I mean no disrespect to my commercial bank, First Global Bank. So just a little pitch in there, right? So what I want to also highlight then is an issue about what the consumers want. They really want instant gratification, and they want it to cost nothing. True? Yeah? I go back to the airplane. But anyway, but we have a methodology. We have to realize that over the last several centuries, the cost of transferring money and the time it takes to transfer money has dramatically reduced. Think about sailing ships moving bullion, gold, whatever, around, and silver. The galleons taking it from the West Indies and Central and South America, taking it back to Europe. Those galleons were loaded with all of the riches and the spoils of the New World. And that took months. Then we moved on to, okay, instead of sailing ships, we had steamships. But they were still moving hard currency around. Then eventually we get the telegram and the postal services moving money. So that's now going to a few days to a single month. Now we're in a situation where it's gone from days to hours, but it still takes time. And the fact is that we have developed technologies such as the one shown here, ACH. Another one is RTGS, which have allowed for consumers and businesses to do these transfers whenever and wherever they want, generally speaking. But it happens at a cost. FinTech offers the promise, and it is a promise, of frictionless payments with near zero effort, zero cost, and zero time. Indeed, there is a process that currently exists within the central banks of many Central American countries, where in fact the transfer from me to you goes through the various central banks and commercial banks, and it occurs instantly within a few seconds. But they put in a hold period of 2 hours before the money actually hits your account. Why is that hold period in there? It's there because they want to do an AML scan on you, anti-money laundering, to verify that it's not coming from ill-gotten methods or gains, and therefore they put a 2-hour hold. And if you cannot prove that it is coming from nefarious activities, then the money is allowed to be deposited. So they've reduced it now to 2 hours, which is great. But blockchain and others allow it to happen in zero time. So what's going to happen is that the new processes, which you can see here maybe, which is that instead of going all the way through the commercial and central banks and back through again, I as a sender, you as a receiver, we're going to use cloud, fintech, blockchain, and cryptocurrencies, not just Bitcoin, but many others. And that transaction is going to occur instantly. It already is occurring instantly, and it occurs seamlessly, and it really does have no cost attached to it. So the word for today is disintermediation. Every one of the intermediates is being done away with. Quick look. I know this is hard for everyone to see, but I wanted to give you a heads up in terms of where FinTech is coming from or going to. Top 10 most innovative FinTech firms according to CNBC as of November of this year. 5 of the top 10 are from China. 4 are from the US, 1 from the UK. The number 1 is a little small outfit called Ant Financial. But it's run by Ali. Their brand is actually Alipay. Back to the cover slide. And it's owned by a gentleman by the name of Jack Ma. Does anybody know who Jack Ma is? Alibaba. Alibaba is bigger than Amazon. Okay, so think about that. So the list is there. The other name that shows up is Peter Thiel, gentleman out of the US. But he's heavily invested. He owns PayPal, by the way. So he's invested heavily in many of the other FinTech startups. So he sees where this is going. So the issue is that the FinTechs are providing alternatives to all segments of banking, and all are therefore likely to be disrupted. The other point I want to make is that 3, 4, 5 billion persons on this earth are underserved or not being served from a financial point of view at this point today. Therefore, they have no loyalty or trust relationships with existing banks. Who's Bank of Nova Scotia, with all due respect? I won't go to who's First Global Bank, because that's an irrelevance. But the fact is that the person who is in some location that is not obtaining any banking solutions now is ripe for being taken over or getting services from Alipay or Amazon Cash or Google Cash or whomever, because they're already familiar with those brands. Now all those brands have to do is offer financial services. So here is what's known as a hype cycle, courtesy of Gartner. Gartner is an extraordinarily good and rich source of information in terms of research and guidance on IT. And they look at many different technologies, and their hype cycle basically says, look, it starts to emerge, you start to hear about it, then everybody gets euphoric about it, then it crashes into this well of despair, and everybody walks away, and then some of the stuff actually matures, and then comes along and kills the incumbents. And for blockchain, what you see is that on the startup side of it is a whole bunch of areas that you'd never think of. But blockchain certainly blockchain in finance is becoming mature. But blockchain in healthcare, blockchain in retail, blockchain in supply chain, blockchain in voting, all of those technologies are going to come our way. And so we need to be prepared. I would be remiss if I didn't talk about voice and bots. Craig mentioned earlier Alexa and I think it's Google Home is what it's called, yeah, Google Home. 25 million consumers in the US, not in Jamaica. 10 million homes currently have Amazon's, the equivalent of these things. We're moving away from going to your smartphone or your tablet or your computer to interact with the internet. We're using our voices to do that because the technologies to do voice recognition and understanding are now very mature. So what that means is that we're going to end up where, with these devices in our homes, we are going to be always connected to the internet. We're never going to have downtime. We're never going to have separation. So as my view is, I think that's for the sociologists to figure out what those implications are. We keep talking about the millennials as the up and coming. The truth is over 50% of the workforce in the US and probably most developed nations are now millennials. So get over it, folks. Millennials are part of our workforce. It's Generation Z, those born after I think it's 1985 or 1990 or something, 2000 or something like that. Those folks are the ones who have never had life without something that their two thumbs are working with. And we cannot understand or forecast well what the implications of that that change in how people interact with each other are. But it's coming. So I think it's very important as well, just as the thumbprint was used on the smartphone with a resulting diversion of airplane, the Alexas and the homes and all of that, unless you tell them, turn yourself off, they're going to be on. So they're going to hear all your conversations. And the Googles of this world are going to be gathering that information to learn about you and predict exactly what you want. There's a story, just as an aside, around Target. Target got hacked a couple of years ago, and that was a real disaster. And they did stupid things. They had all their passwords stored in a text file. Can you guess what the name of the file was? .txt. Don't forget that. And was it encrypted or password protected? No, no. So yeah, people do stupid things. But Target, a couple of years before, was doing some really extraordinary stuff, learning about artificial intelligence, learning about data mining, and so on. And there was this gentleman who started to receive emails from Target saying, cribs on sale, and diapers on sale, and you too can buy these lovely baby outfits and so on. And he said, hang on, I'm a Tower consumer, and he fired off this letter back to somebody in Tower, not Tower, in Target. And he said, look, how dare you tell me about this? I have no one who's pregnant or has a child in my house. And they came back and said, oh, yes, you do. And no, I don't. And it turned out that they could tell him that his daughter was pregnant, and they could actually say about the month when she became pregnant, just by how her pattern of search had changed. That goes from good way over to creepy. But it is where we are, folks, and therefore we are the best custodians of our data, and we must do what we must to protect it. We have NIDs in our midst. Maybe I shouldn't use that phrase, but we have NIDs in our midst. But the truth is, we have to also be aware that much of what we have provided to Facebook and all the others goes way beyond. So there's something to think about. Finally, banking. Banking is changing, for sure, and it has to change. And the theory is, the hope is that banks themselves will not disappear, at least not all of them. But the combination of cloud, mobile, big data, and social, plus Internet of Things, is driving systemic change. Underserved consumers are going to be attracted to these fintech services because they will have brands that they have greater affinity to than the traditional bank brands. So brand loyalty doesn't exist, and therefore trust relationships don't exist with existing banks. So therefore their trust will be placed in these other institutions. Many of us trust Facebook and our 423,000 friends. Okay, and I don't mean to knock Facebook necessarily. All right, so smart banks will either buy or assimilate or merge with fintechs into their space. But frankly, other banks are definitely going to fade away. It has happened everywhere else. And I want to also just highlight that Amazon bought Whole Foods recently, yes? And you have to recognize that is a symptom. It is that a pure play digital business may, and I use the word may, not be the best business model for a industry vertical such as banking. It could be that you end up with remaining some brick and mortar, some block and steel, but a lot will be in the internet space or digital. And finally, people, businesses, and countries need banking and financial services. That's a given. But will they get them from our current brands, or will they get them from new brands? Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you so much. I did tell you that we have the best team in town. They were supposed to take 40 minutes, and they took exactly 40 minutes in delivering. Thank you so much. Give them another round of applause. So what we have heard today are some very interesting thoughts, and we're going to open for questions. But just before we go to questions, keep in mind the very important points from their presentation. Disintermediation, critical point to note, and avoid the strategy of the commons, but importantly, focus on stewardship and not compliance. I would say I want to focus on both. I don't want to get into jail. So very, very important points to note as well. But as we open the floor for questions, please just keep the questions really precise, because we're out of time. So Professor Dunn, we have about 20 minutes for question. So keep it very precise, and then we'll ask our panel to respond. So we'll take about 3 in each round, and then we'll ask you to respond. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
As we're waiting for a question, I was just going to say that stewardship really builds into trust of brands that you talked about and for underserved. So again, so obviously I think a lot of synergy between our sessions there. Go ahead. That was a
Yeah, I get to ask questions now. No, my question is really for Simon. In your presentation, you spoke about disintermediation and the concept behind blockchains and the ledgers is really to remove the middleman. But at the end, you maintain that some of these fintechs that depend on these platforms will become banks. But the idea is to eliminate them. So I'm trying to understand what your viewpoint is as it relates to still maintaining what is traditionally the bank in the reality that is what we generally call fintech or blockchain-driven services and networks. That's the first question. The second question has to do with the concern that coming out of that, when you have disintermediation, when you have a highly sophisticated and technical bartering system that prevails, what happens to governments and countries that depend on the middleman and the transactions that occur to finance the existence and provision of service to its citizens? So I'm just curious as to what your thoughts are on that.
Gee, thank you so much. Okay, so if I touch base on blockchain technologies first, when you think of blockchain, I think one of the fundamental guideposts for blockchain is that it is extraordinarily useful when there isn't a trust relationship between the two endpoints. If there is trust, then blockchain is almost like overkill. But where you do start to implement blockchain, you're right in that it results in disintermediation for sure, and traditional banks are going to have a hard time. However, people still need banking. I would still want to be able to deposit my funds and in theory earn some real interest in it. Yeah, I do say in theory, folks. All right, so oh gosh, I just stepped in it. But anyway, so you end up with an issue that where there are persons who have a good trust relationship with their current banking arrangements, both from a consumer point of view as well as a business point of view, a source of funds for expansion, etc., those persons or organizations are likely to remain within the what I would call the normal current banking process. But there are a huge number of people in the developing nations of our world who are currently unbanked completely. I think those are the easiest targets for blockchain technologies, for banking and other services. I think that's where it's going to go first. The real risk with many businesses that have been extraordinarily profitable for a long time is that they end up seeding the low end of the market to some emerging technology, but they do nothing about their cost profile. And eventually they start to see their profits switch to losses, and then they go out of business. We've seen that story written many, many, many times. And blockchain is going to do that for many, many different industry verticals, not just banking. Second question, with regards to, remind me, sorry. I know you're trying to set me up there a bit.
No, when we talk about what happens as a result of removing the middleman.
Yeah, so the middleman, the question, there are two sides to it. One of them is the ability for example, central banks to have a clear knowledge of where the funds are flowing, to be able to have good fiscal policy and monetary policy. For sure, that's a simple recording bit of information coming off of a blockchain stream to know that this is what's actually happened. I don't think that that is an inherent problem reporting-wise. But where you can get zero-cost transactions taking place, and where you layer on top of that, for example, 3D printing. I no longer need to buy a car part from Japan. I just have a 3D printer at my friend just down the street. He prints the part for me. The revenues that would flow to government about the importation and duties and all of that kind of stuff for the parts coming into the country, those revenues go away. And that's just one simple example. Heaven help us when we get teleportation and then we can go anywhere for tourism purposes. So, there is a risk. And so central banks have a big challenge on their hands, and governments who rely on revenues, tax revenues, in particular trans-border tax revenues to fund services to the economy. There are challenges ahead.
Let me add to that. I think it's really, I do believe that chart, the Gardner chart about the hype of blockchain, because we're already seeing it. And like Venmo, like my kids, millenniums, they're using that. Someone wants to give them money. It's not really dealing with the bank, and it's really an online payment process, and and it doesn't go into the bank itself. So you want these tickets. You transfer the money to me, I'll give you the ticket. So in a sense, we're seeing some of this already. It's not really a blockchain, but it's really getting back to, I think, the point that you brought. It's a frictionless, easy process dealing with someone you don't necessarily have a relationship with. So I think we're always going to see that. There's going to be something in 5 years that's going to surpass blockchain.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it gets back down to the ease of the process. And we're already seeing in developing countries, again, mobile payments, and not on smartphones, but just texting back and forth. So,
I guess I should mention GKMP here, but anyway, I won't.
Shiva Bisasa, Pinnacle Technology Solutions. Question for Simon. And first of all, Craig, great presentation. And I think Trevor, one of the things Craig mentioned was about the breach documentation that they're producing. I think that will go a long way towards awareness with small businesses. So that's a very good thing. For Simon, as you mentioned, blockchain. Where is Grace with respect to its remittance business in examining blockchain as a promising technology, or how far along the trajectory are you in, practical implementation of new solutions?
Okay, so I guess the simplest answer would be I could tell you, but then I'd have to kill you. But seriously, folks, yeah, it's that our partner, which is Western Union, is spending an incredible amount of money in terms of utilizing technologies such as blockchain to strengthen their supply chain, because what they're doing is their supply chain is moving money, right? That's what it really boils down to. So we know that they're working on that. What they're also working really hard on is dramatically improving their posture from a compliance and regulatory compliance point of view, KYC and all this kind of stuff, as are all remittance businesses. And the reason for that is, of course, all the anti-money laundering, the various laws and regulations that exist from both sending countries as well as receiving countries. So they're working on it. Where they are, I cannot say.
Okay, any other question? Any other question? There must be. Well, you want to add something?
I think the other thing, and tying back to the morning, is and I mentioned briefly on one of the slides about the regulatory landscape. And obviously, I think it's great that Jamaica is moving forward in regulation, or I should say laws that will drive regulation. But also just want to reinforce the element and the impact of GDPR, General Data Protection Directive. It goes in effect, I believe, May 25th of 2018. And that affects every data processor and every data controller in the aspect of all you need to have is one resident, not a citizen, a resident of the EU that you're holding their data. And so we need to look at that. And that's a good example that I tell people, be thinking about that. That's where you need to be driving towards, more of the opt-in. But that is very expansive, everything from a 72-hour notification to your primary regulatory authority of a data loss incident, to the requirement, if you have 200 employees, having a data protection officer, which is separate from a chief security officer, separate from a chief privacy officer. So I think I encourage companies to be thinking about that model, because again, I think that is the bar in a sense. Or Canada's done some great stuff also in the anti-spam element of the CASL. So there's some areas to think about. So don't wait for regulation here alone, but be thinking about looking ahead. And again, that gets back in what I would say the stewardship model. Be thinking about that, because eventually you'll have to do there. And so as you're engineering your product services, be thinking about that.
Denzel, if I could just add as a caution, if you have a resident or citizen of the EU purchasing one of our products made in Jamaica through the internet, and their data gets breached, then our company is liable. And that liability is, the original draft was a very simple formula. It's 4%, I think it was 10%, no, 4% of your global revenues, or 10% of your, no, or 50% of your profits, or something like that. Basically what it did was it was going to wipe you out financially, or certainly hurt you for a long time. And so it's huge to understand that laws being established in one jurisdiction to protect their citizens because of the global interconnectedness have direct impact on businesses and governments everywhere. So don't think it again that a law in the UK or a law in the US can't impact us. It does.
Yeah. And it's between 2 and 4% of your annual turnover. So it's not profits, your annual revenue, and that is huge. So you may say, well, 2%, but it gets down to what the law states in there. So even though you only sold $100 to someone in Japan, or I'm saying in the EU, that they could effectively, conceptually come and look at your worldwide revenue.
Trevor, before you come, I really want to pick up a question on that, because hearing you on this particular issue, you mentioned that some banks will survive, Simon. Do you think small banks can survive with all these regulatory and security costs that they have to face?
Well, that's a tough question. I believe that banks that morph into offering having a significant digital presence, that make themselves relevant to the underserved in their communities, in their countries, have scale through the internet that the incumbent larger banks currently enjoy. Yes, there is a risk and a cost to invest in all the technologies. But I think that the cost of getting an app or the cost of building out a blockchain technology, the cost of building a banking platform actually is declining. So I think one of the points I'd made, I didn't emphasize it, is that the technology providers, the traditional technology providers, the brands that we're familiar with, such as SAP and Oracle and a whole bunch of others, all of those businesses are themselves aggressively going after reshaping themselves, because their current business models and their current product offer are stale dated. They just really need to move on. So all of us are under threat. All of us are under pressure. Small or big, I think you can still survive.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting to think about it. We, I'm not going to say what bank that we have a relationship with, but I don't know if we have a relationship. We've been with them for 15 years, my wife and I. We aren't real happy about some things they've done that's been disclosed. So I don't want to say I don't feel loyalty to that bank, and I'm not even sure I would say I have a relationship with them. I do have a lot of things that have automatic payment, and it's a pain that we've gone through. Do we want to go through that? We have, you know, some of our credit cards are automatic payment to there. So it's that friction there, but it's not loyalty in our end of the thing. And I think as the mobile, and look at my own kids, they don't care, and they don't have that many. I think so there's lack of loyalty, even with a well-served audience, I'm suggesting. I don't think that loyalty is where we think it before. You don't walk in, you don't have a relationship per se.
All right, we're going to take this final round of questions, and then we ask our panelists to respond, and then we wrap up. So, Trevor, and then...
yeah, so I just wanted to thank the panelists for highlighting some of the specifics as it relates to what companies will have to do as a result of data protection legislation and regulation, especially as it relates to the fact that, and again, earlier we, mentioned that we did consider GDPR in our, in our data protection legislation, but it is a real situation that has to be considered by everybody. That look, all it takes is one EU customer in your database, and if you suffer that breach, that is what can happen. All right. So I just wanted to thank you for bringing that forward. The last thing I just wanted to speak to, which we kind of gloss over quite a bit, and it had to do with your point on Internet of Things and the security of that. I think I don't think we always appreciate the seriousness of that, because one of the things that we have to be cognizant of is the fact that IoT devices, sensors such as your Fitbit and other such things at home, these things don't ask you for information, they take it, right? And the question we really need to ask is, okay, when it takes my information, where does it put it? And this is something that, again, we sometimes gloss over, but you have to consider it, because, again, data protection legislation in the global space is necessary to treat with this kind of stuff, because can anybody here tell me physically where their Fitbit data goes? Amuse yourself and do that research when you go home. Okay? So it's very important for legislation to be far-reaching, not only in this local jurisdiction, but wherever information on you can exist and be stored. Thank you.
Let me, on the IoT thing, and thank you very much there. One of the things that we developed through a very broad multi-stakeholder international effort is what's called the IoT Trust Framework, a set of principles, 40 principles. That's now being adopted by different government agencies on different parts of it. And it's the security of the device, it's the disclosures, and as importantly, it's the life cycle or the sustainability issues related to that. So patching of the device. And so, for example, it's not just is the device secure when it's shipped, how is it maintained security over its expected life? So a TV, for example, there's industry norms for a TV relatively 7 years. So the assumption is not the warranty, it's about security patches, and we need to be thinking about that. And the challenge that we identified in our framework, in our working group, is that there's so many, it's a wild west, and there's so many new products coming to the market. Are we thinking about that? And clearly the data privacy is one of it, clarity is one, and it's also the disclosure. And I got in an argument with the acting chairwoman of the Federal Trade Commission, and her comment was, well, if on first use you get that screen that says this is what we do with your data, that's notice. And that's the old regime. And the reason I point that up, are you thinking about that? That's the old model of notice. And it's not when you buy the TV in Miami and you ship it here to Jamaica or you on your airplane and you mount it on the wall, and notice isn't when you turn it on and says to use those smart features you have to agree to data being shared. So what we're really saying is that type of notice needs to be prior to acquisition, prior to purchase, and so some big issues on there. But I agree, thanks for your point there, and those are things that we as consumers need to be thinking about, developers need to be thinking about, and also I think there's a responsibility of the people that sell those products to be thinking about.
Okay. Afternoon, Ordinary Tucker. Craig, in your presentation, you spoke about notification as being one of the threat management things, right? I'm aware also that when the UK was discussing their data protection regulation, the question came up as to whether or not notification should be an endemic part of the process. The question is, what's the thought, and this is for the FinTech, both large and small, wherever, to what extent is notification to customers particularly, especially with the rise of these smaller systems and portals, would it be necessary for institutions to notify their customers in the event of a breach and as a mechanism? And do you think that it would be beneficial to the FinTech or to the consumers for such notification to be provided?
Great question, and there's 4 dimensions of notification. One, as a company, how are you handling notifications third parties are providing you, and how are you acting on that, and do you have a vehicle to that? And that really falls into what we call really, that type of notification is what vulnerability disclosures or coordinate disclosures. And one of the challenges that we're finding more often, some of these breaches are happening because the company failed to respond to a third-party notification. That's one aspect of it. The other one, there's 3 sides of it. It's notifying law enforcement, notifying regulatory authorities, and the consumer or the impacted party is really on there. And there is a lot of debate on that notification to the impacted party. Let me kind of say, there's a challenge of notifying the regulator. First of all, it's like, someone broke into my house. I don't know if they stole something. So do I notify the police now, or do I wait till I have an inventory? And there's a challenge in the real world of a breach. You don't know what's been impacted. And you may not know right away. As you do more forensics, you find out more data has been compromised. And so the last thing we want in wearing Simon's hat is go out and say it's been 2 million records and then have to recant a week later. It's 5 million, because then we look foolish. So there's that tension there of, we don't want, as a business, you want to have as full picture of what happened. So that's the notification to the regulators there. In the EU, just very specific, it's 72 hours that an incident occurred. It's not saying that you have all the details. They just want to know that an incident has happened for lots of different reasons. One, maybe canary in the mine that it was one bank here, another bank here, and say, geez, we've got a very coordinated effort going on to all the industry. On the aspect of the consumers, I'm sorry it's a long answer here, question is, what do they benefit from? And there's, in the US and in other countries, that consumers been overwhelmed with these notices, and do they become numb? Do they ignore them? And so there's a lot of debate on that, especially if the data's been encrypted. In certain areas, if the data's been encrypted and the keys haven't been compromised, then what benefit does there happen by notifying a consumer? Because is there any harm? So there's a lot of debate on what the value of notification does there. On the other aspect is the Equifax one was very broad in there. So I'm kind of, I can wear both hats on the value of that, but I think that there's been so many breaches, so many. If you haven't received a few letters, you know, of your data's been compromised, you're probably off the grid, which might be a good thing. So I don't know there. Did you want to?
Yeah, if I could just add that the studies show that the time of breach to time of detection is somewhere between 40 and hundreds of days. So there's a real question about when are you going to notify the regulatory authorities? It's when you discover it. But it actually could have occurred weeks or months beforehand. What I do believe that all of the various regulations have, though, is that if you have taken good and appropriate security steps within your organization to protect the data, then you substantially mitigate against the 2 to 4% of global revenue hit that you will take. If you can show that you've done due diligence and you have the appropriate checks and balances in place, then it is likely to be, okay, you need to tighten up on your systems, or we can learn from it. If you have done nothing, or you have done even more than nothing, you have been stupid, then you surely deserve the 2 to 4% of global revenue. And by the way, 2 to 4% of most businesses is their annual profits. Right. So you think about all of the businesses in Jamaica. NCB reported 19 billion of profit this year. Imagine if the fine came along and it's 19 billion gone from NCB. That would hurt a lot.
Okay, thank you very much. That's a very sober note on which to end. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm pretty sure that you will agree with me that they have fed us with very, very rich and practical information, and I want you to give them another round of applause and thank them very much. Thank them very much for this session. So this brings our session to a close, Professor Dunn, and we'll ask you to move to the next one. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This was an A team all around, including the chairing. So can we give them all another round of applause, including Professor Williams. We are going to try to make a very quick transition to the next panel. We will still take a break, but 5-10 minutes just to get them set up, and then the session will be going along. That way, we all get out here a little earlier. So if you can bear with us, then we will ask the leaders of the next panel to take their places while you take a very short break, and then we resume in 5 to 10 minutes.